long-time MP for Dublin, J.P. Nannetti, told the Irish Trade Union Congress in 1906, the Irish Parliamentary Party were the Labour Party. The platform on which he was proud to stand was broad enough for any working man. They could make this parliamentary party do anything they wished. And as anyone familiar with sort of 20th century Irish politics, you could substitute that for Fianna Fáil during the 1930s and subsequently. So we don't need any, separate representation. We are the real Labour Party. So the unionist position took quite the opposite view, less based in wishful thinking, with a more explicit class analysis. Its foremost proponent was William Walker, who argued that the Irish trade union movement should establish its own political organisation, but that it would be subordinate to British Labour. Two developments upended the state of affairs. So in 1909, the Asquith government declared its support for Irish Home Rule. And as Ireland came closer and closer to some form of self-government, opposition to an independent Irish Labour Party declined amongst nationalists, since if there was going to be an Irish Parliament, there ought to be Irish Labour presence within it. The second development was the founding of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in 1909 and its affiliation to Congress the following year. Now, the Transport Union was fundamentally nationalist and strongly in favour of taking political action, with James Larkin and his lieutenants, most notably James Connolly, some of the most vocal proponents of an independent Labour Party around this time. Larkin and Connolly were trade unionists first and foremost. As Connolly had put it in Socialism Made Easy, the fight for the conquest of the political state is not the battle, it is only the echo of the battle. But that didn't mean that the political struggle could be ignored. As Larkin observed, I believe that the workers should use every weapon against entrenched powers of capitalism. I am an industrialist and at the same time appreciate the fact that Labour can accomplish a great deal through the intelligent use of the ballot. Why use one arm when we have two? In 1911, a motion to establish an Irish Labour Party was defeated after stormy debate, but the following year, on the 11th of April 1912, the third Home Rule Bill was introduced in the House of Commons, which meant that when Congress delegates met in Clonmel the following month, they did so with self-government a very imminent prospect. Congress had asked, when the representatives of Connolly had asked, when the representatives of Ireland come to meet in the old historic building in Dublin, which they had heard so much about, were the workers to be the only class not to be represented? So the vote by 49 to 18 in favour of setting up the party was remarkable and indicative of the growing influence of the Transport Union within the trade union. But vital as it was merely the first hurdle. Building up an actual Labour Party based on trade union Congress should not have been as difficult as it proved, but when they began their task, the men charged with the job, William O'Brien, James Larkin and Thomas Johnson, encountered resistance from Jim Larkin, their chairman, who, having campaigned for such a thing for years, now adopted a petulant attitude towards the whole endeavour. Larkin not only refused to cooperate, but he was actively obstructive, most notably when efforts to organise a public meeting to launch the new party in Dublin in September. Having refused to have anything to do with the meeting, he turned up and sat with a group of dockers at the back of the hall. Called on to speak from the floor, he took to the platform and denounced the whole proceedings. After this fiasco, the new party effectively stalled until after the 1913 Congress, which reaffirmed the previous year's decision. Now, Larkin's behaviour towards setting up the new party was never properly explained beyond it being an example of Big Jim at his worst, being unwilling to cooperate with his comrades since, as Connolly put it, he must rule or he will not work. It may also have owed something to do with a recent step back Larkin had encountered in Dublin. A Dublin Labour Party based around the Dublin Trades Council and with no connection to the Trade Union Congress had been established in 1911. It contested its first council election in January 1912, where despite accusations by the Irish Independent that they were, among other things, atheists and child murderers, Jim Larkin and 4 others took 5 of the available 20 seats. But Larkin's victory here was short-lived. A month after his election, he was sued for his seat on the grounds that he was debarred as a convicted felon, and he was prohibited from sitting on the corporation for 7 years. His removal from the corporation had a considerable impact on him personally and on the Dublin movement more generally. His biographer, Emmett Larkin, has identified this as a crucial turning point, although Arthur Mitchell has played down its importance, arguing that Larkin's primary interest at the time was in the industrial struggle anyway. But his abrupt expulsion from the corporation came at a bad time, not only for the Dublin Labour Party, but for the National Party as well. Notwithstanding his mercurial character, it could help to explain how one of the staunchest supporters of establishing an independent Congress-based party in Ireland could then obstruct its progress at every possible turn. Few episodes in Irish history illustrated the failure of politics as vividly as the Dublin lockout of 1913, either at a local level or beyond. Even if one took the view that there was little which could have been done either in London or in City Hall to end the conflict, there was a moral failure on the part of most of the Irish Parliamentary Party representatives to do anything other than represent the interests of the employers. Indeed, arguably, British MPs showed more interest in the crisis, even if ultimately their efforts bore no fruit. There was the intervention by the Liberal government in London, and the British Labour Party also became active. Its involvement, along with that of the British TUC, proved difficult, achieved nothing, and ended badly. Even before the lockout, there was bad blood between Larkin and several of the British trade union leaders, a number of whom were MPs. The British trade union leadership did not support Larkin's militancy, and they were concerned that any of their own members might emulate it. But after Bloody Sunday on the 31st of August, which left 2 men dead and hundreds injured, the mood shifted. The TUC, which was in the middle of its Congress, when word reached them of the scenes in Dublin, the following day suspended their standing orders and voted for an inquiry. And as Emmett Larkin has noted, subsequently the TUC and the British Labour Party were to be integral to the search for a settlement. On Wednesday, a deputation, including Arthur Mitchell MP, left for Dublin, and the TUC delegation did little to make themselves popular with their hosts by refusing to address a public meeting when they arrived on Wednesday night. I apologise if I'm covering ground here that Colin has done earlier, but the next morning they had a meeting with the Under-Secretary in Dublin Castle, and William O'Brien recalled when they returned they were changed men. Apparently they got a bad opinion of us from the castle authorities. On the other hand, the Dublin side became deeply suspicious of the visitors, who they suspected of trying to do a deal behind Larkin's back. In the end, British Labour promised aid, which was necessary and welcome, but for Larkin and the others, they did not want mere charity, they wanted solidarity. Larkin wanted a sympathetic strike, and British Labour leaders had no intention of letting him have one. Neither were they supportive of blacking goods to Ireland. Larkin, who had been arrested on Bloody Sunday, was finally released and travelled to England on the 12th of September. Once there, diplomatic as ever, he denounced the British trade union movement as absolutely rotten to a public meeting in Manchester, adding that the British Labour leaders were damnable hypocrites. He damned them collectively and then lambasted them by name. Connolly, for his part, called them old fossils willing to sell the pass at any time. The hostility from the Irish leaders met with more measured response from their British counterparts, or at least in public anyway. But it was clear that they believed that the Dublin unions were, quote, undisciplined and dangerous, in Snowden's words, and that Larkin's syndicalism was poor fighting and 15 years out of date. The British TUC decided to wait until December to hold a conference to try to resolve the dispute, but the level of mutual recrimination mitigated against a settlement. The final TUC peace initiative, headed by the Labour leader Arthur Henderson, took place in Dublin on the 18th of December, but ended in a shambles amidst mutual recrimination. There was not only no deal, but the British side had lost patience, and the monetary support which had been so crucial in keeping the strike going dried up thereafter. The British Labour Party displayed considerably more concern about the strike than the Irish parliamentarians, however. 4 of the 6 Home Rule MPs for Dublin wrote to the Lord Lieutenant calling for an inquiry into police behaviour on Bloody Sunday. Among them were William Field and J.P. Nannetti, who had once been conduits between the Home Rule Party and the trade union movement, but they were long out of touch with their colleagues in the craft unions and had no relationship whatsoever with the new unionism, which they regarded as being too militant by far. But while the Dublin MPs expressed regret at the deplorable crisis and offered their assistance in finding a resolution, their colleagues outside of the capital were less helpful. Prior to the lockout, where Home Rule MPs expressed an opinion on industrial relations, they sang from a hymn sheet that could have been composed by William Martin Murphy himself. The historian James McConnell has noted the words of Tipperary East Home Rule MP, who himself was a former Fenian, Tom Condon, during the rail strikes of 1911, who said, "In a fair fight for better terms, the workers could always have the warm support of the people, but no such question arose in this case, since, he said, the strike had been forced upon them by the action of a few outsiders from England." As McConnell observed, subsequent pronouncements by nationalist MPs closely followed this line. In principle, the party supported the right of Irish trade unions to strike when they had legitimate grievances, but that the sympathetic strike was not only an illegitimate means of protest, but one foisted on Irish workers by foreign interests. The lockout initially seemed to find the Home Rule MPs without a voice, but several weeks in, David Sheehy broke the silence, declaring that the good relations between employer and worker in Dublin had been subverted by the hideous monster Jim Larkin. With this, Sheehy started a steady stream of abuse aimed directly at Larkin, who was described as an autocrat and a wild, egotistical fanatic, a socialist, an Englishman, and an opponent of the church. Of those publicly lending support to Larkin, there were almost none. The progressive Galway MP Stephen Gwynn was a notable exception, although he remained silent until November, and others gave their full sympathies to the workers, but only in private. The extent to which there was hidden support for the workers in the Irish Parliamentary Party is something of a moot point, however, since the locked-out members needed more than silent goodwill. They needed moral and practical support, which was not forthcoming. More telling was the determination of the senior Home Ruler John Dillon to enforce silence amongst those who might sympathise with the Larkinites. There was no love lost between Dillon and William Martin Murphy, whose personal and political antipathy went back decades. As Dillon wrote in October, "Murphy is a desperate character. Larkin is bad. It would be a blessing to Ireland if they exterminated each other." Truthfully, while Dillon hated Murphy personally, his antipathy towards Larkin and his politics was far greater. As a middle-class, property-owning member of the political elite, he abhorred the socialism and militancy espoused by Larkin, and as his biographer has noted, his enmity towards Larkin was, quote, instinctive and went deeper perhaps than he wanted to admit even to himself. Quite apart from this, Dillon was perceptive enough to see Larkinism as a very dangerous enemy to Home Rule, the government and the Nationalist Party, and he was not alone in this view. There was a very real fear that Labour threatened the Nationalist Party's hegemony, and this was clearly evident at the municipal elections in January 1914, which was deemed sufficiently dangerous that in some wards other candidates withdrew so as not to split the vote and give the Nationalists a better chance against Labour. Naturally, those involved in the conflict regarded the contest as an important opportunity to secure public support. Coming almost 5 months after the lockout began, a strong result for Labour would have represented a display of solidarity when it needed it most. There was a problem, however. Though the Labour side recognised that they needed to do well in the contest, they were slow to organise, and a full list of candidates was not ratified until 3 days before polling and 6 days after nominations had closed. Initially intending to field candidates in all 20 wards, half that many were endorsed, along with the socialist Walter Carpenter, who stood as independent Labour. Despite the fact that he was not a candidate in the election, the character of Larkin overshadowed the whole of the Dublin Labour Party. Now, perhaps this is unsurprising, but it's significant that even the Irish Times, which, though not sympathetic to the workers, was somewhat less partisan than the Independent, labelled the Dublin Labour candidate as Larkinite rather than Labour in all of its reports of the elections. The Independent even suggested that Dubliners had been wondering why it is that Mr. Larkin has apparently been devoting no attention to the strike at all, and all his energies on municipal electioneering, which was patently untrue. But it was part of a narrative which suggested that, along with reasonable people, the Independent had no problem with Labour as such, but just the kind of militant radicalism prescribed by Larkin had to be stopped. Plus a change in many cases, but anyway. In fact, of 10 candidates, 6 were actually from craft unions. And there was a distinct failure on the part of the leaders of the strike to actually run themselves. So ultimately, while the Labour men who stood for the corporation in 1914 were in solidarity with those who had been locked out, they were not at the forefront of the dispute themselves. Not that this could get in the way of anti-Labour propaganda, as the Independent contrasted the old-style trade unionism of earlier years practiced, they said, by men who had some sense of their responsibilities, not only to their class but to the community of which they were part, with the transport union's policy of organised revolt against society, of pure destructiveness, constructive programme they have none. Of course, this was scaremongering and hyperbole, but it was also incorrect to suggest that Labour had no constructive policy. The opposite was actually the case, and industrial issues generally, and the lockout specifically, did not really feature in Labour's campaign, and instead they decried the kind of corruption that existed at City Hall around that time, and the disregard which the councillors had towards the voters and to working class voters specifically. In common with previous years, the key part of the platform was the obscene housing conditions in the city, and calling on voters to vote Labour and sweep away the slums. The party's case was bolstered by the public hearings of the Dublin Housing Inquiry, which shone a light onto the unsanitary and degrading circumstances which tens of thousands of people lived in the city, many of them in slum buildings owned by nationalist members of the corporation. So the campaign itself was short but predictably acrimonious. Nationalist candidates and the press at large rounded on the Labour candidates as godless syndicalists and were assisted enthusiastically by the city's clergy, leaving the Labour candidates to defend themselves against attack. The Nationalists and their allies used every tool at their disposal to smear the Labour candidates, which included the distribution of blasphemous pamphlets purportedly published by the American Labour Party. Labour's campaign was energetic, with open meetings, demonstrations and parades featuring bands and the Citizen Army. The special edition of the Irish Worker declared, "Every vote given against Labour candidates tomorrow is a stab at the heart of Labour and the workers. We work together, live together and tramp together. We strike together, are locked out together and are shot together. The time has come when we must learn to vote together." The campaign was successful in increasing the Labour vote, but not by enough. Though reasonably close run, the Nationalists won practically every seat in the city, with Labour taking only a single seat in Inchicore. Some solace could be found in several narrow results. In 4 seats, it had lost out by only around 150 votes. And in another, it lost out only by a baker's dozen. But that wasn't going to stop the Murphyites from claiming that the contest had seen Labour properly routed and that the result was a final blow to Larkin. It lost seats outside of Dublin too, and the results were all the worse because they had been unexpected. Though accusing the Nationalist candidates of using corporation workers to canvass for them and decrying their smear campaign against the Labour candidates, Larkin suggested that the timing had been the deciding factor. claiming that had the election taken place 2 months earlier, they could have claimed 8 victories. Perhaps that would have happened. It's impossible to know and the figure of 8 victories seems kind of arbitrary, but it does suggest that Larkin knew that the antipathy towards him personally, if anything, had grown stronger in the city as the dispute went on. Arthur Mitchell has argued that the failure of Labour in the Dublin elections was crucial in ending the lockout. That seems kind of unlikely, and the other factors are much more important. But some months later, at a meeting of Dublin Corporation held on the 20th of April, the Labour councillors tabled a motion asking that the Trade Union Congress be allowed to use City Hall for its annual meeting in June. Councillor John Saturnus Kelly, a renegade trade unionist, a vehement anti-Larkinite, and until its collapse in October 1913, leader of Murphy's Yellow Union, the Irish Railway Workers' Trade Union, spoke trenchantly against the idea, saying he objected to, quote, the national flag being pulled down from City Hall in Whit Week and having it replaced by the red flag of syndicalism and socialism. But he was very much in the minority on the council, and the motion was carried on division by a large majority. Now, coming so shortly after the lockout had ended, it is significant that Irish Labour would be allowed to use Dublin's municipal buildings for its annual gathering, not forgetting that it had been barred from doing the same thing in Clonmel 2 years earlier. Perhaps the councillors felt safe because they believed Larkin had been vanquished. More likely, however, it is that the majority of nationalist councillors had regarded Labour as a very real political threat to their position, but they did not regard the Labour movement as socially dangerous as their campaign of vilification and the elections had made out. And their campaign in January had been nothing more than burlesque. In any case, it was in City Hall that delegates to the 21st Annual Congress met on the morning of the 1st of June, when on the motion of William O'Brien, Jim Larkin was unanimously elected President of Congress. Larkin's address to Congress was informed by 2 main events of the past year, the Dublin lockout and the new Home Rule Bill, which proposed to exclude Ulster. The lesson he took from both was that for the first time in history, he said, the Labour movement in Ireland could have a party of its own, and that the Labour Party would be born and got upon its feet that week. And unlike previous occasions, this time it was with one of the first items of business being to adopt a draft constitution of what would be, from that point, the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party. Of course, Larkin had spoken of the pressing need for an Irish Labour Party many times before, only to scotch its progress just as it was starting 2 years earlier. But this time was different. The lockout had demonstrated most clearly that industrial action on its own was not enough. As Mitchell observed, both Larkin and Connolly recognised that Labour's lack of political power weakened the case of the industrial struggle in 1913 and 14. Neither had reached the point, however, where they would place the same weight on political action as that of industrial action. As Connolly told Congress, political power must wait upon economic or industrial power. You must be strong on the dock, ship, railway or workshop before you can be strong in the halls of legislation. But if political power will only come as the ripened fruit of economic power, agitation need not wait, nor yet wait for political organisation. Then let them march abreast, the army of organised labour, the director of the campaign on both fields. At a national level, the strikers had been wholly isolated. They had received almost no support from the Irish Parliamentary Party, and the behaviour of the British Labour Party had shown that their sister party could not be relied on either. If the relationship between the Irish and British Labour parties had not been good prior to the lockout, it was positively poisonous afterwards. Fraternal relations were so bad that in 1914, a request by the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party that it be allowed keep a proportion of the political levy collected by British trade unions organising in Ireland, rather than it go in its entirety to the British Labour Party, was rejected outright by Ramsay MacDonald and Arthur Henderson. They had no, Irish workers had no allies beyond themselves, and the only answer was to establish a strong independent Irish Labour Party. Politically as well as industrially, the lockout ended with no winners. The Irish Parliamentary Party had staved off the threat from Labour in the short term, but at what cost? Observing events in exile, Lennon wrote, "The Dublin events mark a turning point in the history of the labour movement and of socialism in Ireland. Murphy has threatened to destroy the Irish unions. He has succeeded only in destroying the last remnants of the influence of the Irish nationalist bourgeoisie over the Irish proletariat." Now, Lennon may have overstated the case around this time, but it's kind of difficult to gauge the actual impact that the lockout had on politics of that time, because too much happened in the years immediately afterwards that we can't isolate one particular factor and treat it in isolation. But it is likely that the IPP's indifference to the Labour issue helped to turn some voters and would-be voters towards political alternatives after 1916, even if the main beneficiary was not Labour itself but Sinn Féin. It didn't happen overnight. When J.P. Nannetti died in April 1915, he was denounced by a Labour councillor who called him an example of what a Labour man ought not to be. He had been tied up with a party which was inimical to Labour. But when the party forced a by-election, its candidate was beaten. But it was beaten by a respectable margin, with about 2,500 votes to about 1,800 votes for the Labour candidate, a result which would have been highly unlikely 2 years earlier. So if politics had little impact on the lockout, it's arguable, or I might suggest that perhaps the lockout had an impression on politics. The lockout provided the Labour movement with a vivid example of the need to be represented politically, and to voters it illustrated how detached nationalist representatives had become from workers in their daily lives. As Connolly told the delegates in the 1914 Congress, they could not wait to organise politically. Let them march abreast, the army of organised labour, the director of the campaign on both fields. It could be the echo of the battle no longer. Thank you.